Welcome to RCR Wireless News. I'm Martha DeGrasse, and today's topic is policy control and charging. I'd like to introduce you to our panelists for today's webinar. Edwin Gans is Director of Product Line Management at Amdocs Data Experience Business Unit. Edwin, thank you so much for joining us today. Please take a minute to tell us a little bit about your role at Amdocs.
Oh, thanks, Michelle. Yeah, glad to be here. I'm the product manager for our policy control platform. That's the vehicle by which we provide the PCRF application. I've been managing the roadmap in that product for around 5 years now.
Great. We're so glad you could be here today. Michelle Nowak is Vice President of Product Management at CSG International. Michelle, thanks for joining us. Please take a minute to tell us a little bit about your company and your role there.
Hi, it's a pleasure to be here this afternoon. Now, CSG International is a market-leading business support solutions and services company that's been serving the majority of the top 100 global communication service providers. We have 30 years of experience in voice, video, data, and content services, offering a broad portfolio of licensed and software as a service-based products and solutions.
Thank you very much. And William Rotch is Director of Solution Architecture for NetCracker. Will, thanks for being here today.
Hi. Yes, I work in solution architecture at NetCracker, and while I've spent most of my 24-year career working in BSS and OSS and various aspects of that, I've actually spent a lot of the last 6 to 8 months working with a focus really on network functions, virtualization, NFV, and software-defined networks, SDN, along with the parent company for NetCracker, which is NEC.
Terrific. Well, we'll look forward to hearing more about all of that. And I'm Martha DeGrasse with RCR Wireless News. RCR Wireless News is a premier news source for the wireless communications industry. Published since 1982, we try to keep our subscribers engaged and informed with breaking stories, features, and industry insights. Follow us on the web at rcrwireless.com and on Twitter at RCR Wireless News. I'd like to also direct your attention to a feature report on our website that is part of our policy control program. Policy Control and Charging, Waiting to be Virtualized, is available at rcrwireless.com. Just click on the Reports tab. Key takeaways from this report. Policy management is a billion-dollar market on track to hit $2.5 billion by 2018. That's according to Infonetics. Policy is evolving to enable new revenue models for carriers, and we're going to talk about that today. Virtualization of policy functions can offer significant OpEx savings, particularly when it comes to billing for new services. And we will also talk about the importance of private clouds for PCC solutions. At this time, I would like to jump right into our first topic, which is how policy control has changed over the past 5 years. Edwin, would you like to begin?
Yes, thank you. Actually, 5 years is a good number to pick because that's more or less when I started managing. We initiated the policy platform program here. Prior to that, and before that, it was really specialized solutions for policy. And even prior to that, we had policy solutions for AAA access, based on AAA access. So it's just what we called static policy. So the main change that we got from policy or PCRF applications was moving from static policy, so that means that's the policy you get when you attach to the network, but it never changes for the duration of your session, to what we call dynamic policy, where now a PCRF is involved in continuously monitoring not only your usage, but also interacting with applications for the purposes of dynamic policy change. So that was the major step when we introduced PCRF. Now that's quite a while ago, let's say close to 5 years ago as that evolved, but now it's become even more where the actual scope of control has changed for a PCRF platform. So it began with just one gateway or one device that you would control, and that would be for very basic applications. You went over a certain amount of usage, we would change your rating group, or we would throttle you, or we would send you a message, or something very basic like that. It was related to fair use and the ability to monitor monthly caps. But now it's come to be a whole lot more in terms of what kind of applications someone can use, different qualities of service for different applications. When is video optimization invoked? When is it not invoked? This particular subscriber, if they're in this congested area, should they get prioritization or not? How do I treat subscribers differently as opposed to one size fits all? So it's changed dramatically from the scope of control of a policy controller, where we went to a very simple device, a gateway, that all it could do to throttle, to now controlling DPIs, deep packet inspection type of platforms. We went to video optimization platforms for how do you render video while you conserve traffic on the network, while at the same time you meet the subscriber's quality of service. Many types of other applications and devices, such as ad inserts and all those type of things. So I'd say in general, it's the scope of control of a policy controller, not just a single device, but many devices that could be in the call path.
Right, and that sort of leads to the next point when you talk about things like video optimization. Mobile data usage has clearly placed new demands on policy control. Michelle, do you want to start us off by talking about that?
Absolutely. So this really just really dovetails to what Edwin was saying. We've really seen policy control evolve from something that is a simple standalone network protectionism perspective to something that's truly a proactive revenue generating tool, focusing on monetizing the underlying data networks and transactions that flow across that network. So as we've seen these data volumes explode, it's really about reliability, scalability, and flexibility that are really key selection criteria when service providers are evaluating their existing and future policy control needs. So reliability in the sense that policy control must always be providing the 5 nines level availability with built-in support for geographic redundancy. Scalability in the sense that policy control must deliver the ability to scale linearly in a cost-effective manner as volumes grow. So support of virtualization and cloud-based scaling and those techniques really become extremely important as the demand increases, and it then is seen as a competitive differentiator. Flexibility, then, in the sense of the policy control solution really has to be easily adaptable to support the extension of the existing models or new business models entirely. So a situation where an operator is tied to a vendor product release cycle or vendor-based professional services for functionality and enhancements will be business impacting and won't scale up in that agile, interconnected world. So it really comes down to, analytics, video optimization, network congestion, but really something key as these data networks grow and these volumes of data grow is that intelligent personalization. So subscribers are effectively being targeted with personalized recommendations and involve the integrations of analytics, catalogs, and offer management systems.
So policy is really moving far beyond charging. Will, would you agree with that?
Yeah, no, I think there's been a maturation really of policy, as Ed and Michelle indicated. I think it's moved, to be more sophisticated, more dimensions, more devices. I think it's kind of had a movement from being much more network-centric initially to being more interwoven and stitched with charging, especially over the last few years. Vendors have looked at that interaction and interplay between charging and policy as a way of dealing with the conundrum of data monetization and trying to grow data revenues. And I think as we look kind of at the crystal ball and looking forward, I see the potential role of policy as broadening considerably, that there are a lot of new challenges, particularly new challenges brought forth by network virtualization itself or by software-defined networks. And these are things which are, potentially driving new and interesting policy decisions that need to be made, and things could go in terms of development different ways. But I think you'll see, rather than just continue on a path where we just have the sort of today's definition of a PCRF and kind of what the 3GPP is defined to do, for example, you'll see a broadening where people are incorporating more into a policy engine and trying to get more bang for your buck and do more with it.
Now, are carriers keeping up with the technology? Are they fully utilizing policy control? What do you think, Edwin?
Well, there's definitely degrees of how they're using it. Some are continuing to use it as very simple, fair user controls, but others are using it extensively. Those specifically travel cards, allowing for casual services for the purposes of, not having to spend too much money when you're traveling. So there's a bit of we call it sticker shock prevention, roaming charge, those type of things, where people can subscribe to different packages while they go out. There are some service providers that have introduced social networking packages where they give you, a charge, a one-time charge, or sorry, a monthly recurring charge of, let's say, $5, and your social networking interaction is not charged under your basic volume quota. Those type of things. We're seeing quite a bit of that. Mostly bill shock prevention, so travel card implementation. We can, detect when somebody's roaming and then charge them in very specific ways, or know that it's been pre-purchased, and also specifically social networking. Those are some of the major ones we've seen.
Okay, great. And Michelle, did you want to chime in on that?
First of all, I agree with everything that Edwin said, though. It's just that, a lot of the operators, they've used policy to, offer different, like data passes, roaming passes, application passes, but we're really seeing their, really the growth around the enterprise plans, looking to voice over LTE, QoS control, and the over-the-top services. So we really expect further service convergence across these different access networks, so that the service providers will be able to expect their policy and control to ensure a seamless subscriber, customer experience across all networks available.
Yeah, actually, if I could just add, I just want to echo that. It's funny, ironic that I left out VoLTE, right? Because that actually is now becoming one of the main focuses. And interestingly enough, that was the major intent of the PCRF when it was first conceived in the 3GPP architecture, as being able to serve IMS applications to guarantee quality. And lo and behold, VoLTE has finally arisen, a few years later. But as the panelists before me said, it is now becoming a prime focus. So it's about time. Service providers are starting to get their feet wet. They're sticking their toes in the water. And ourselves, we have a number of trials with them, and it's actually quite exciting to see this finally take off.
Well, I think VoLTE will enable some new revenue models. So let's talk a little bit about some of the ways, besides just, optimizing the network, carriers can actually explore new revenue models through PCC. Michelle, do you want to start?
Sure, thank you. So I'll just name a couple of these new revenue models that will be enabled. The first is application packages, right? No data charges, say for Facebook, WhatsApp, et cetera, and that's based on subscription. Speed tiers and turbo boost, right? Being able to adjust the QoS. Shared plans, including quota, turbo boost shared across devices, groups, access method, such as, mobile and Wi-Fi. Earlier I mentioned data passes, so you get X megabits in 1 hour, 1 day, et cetera. You pay, for the first Y megabits, and the rest of the day is free. And we're also seeing, though, that the growth will be in those double-sided business models. And I think it was Will that mentioned this: advertising, insert ad, insert sponsorships, and other third-party pays, such as, we see with Kindle today. And I still see that there's going to be really a new revenue model in the dynamic QoS and price variance, depending upon net congestion, time of day. For example, the customer only has included data at night, or agrees to a cheap price but reduced service at peak loads.
Okay, great. Now, we do want to hear from our other panelists about new revenue models, but I also want to point out to everyone listening that if you do have questions for our panelists, there is a questions tab on your GoToWebinar control panel, so feel free to submit your questions, and we will try to get to some of those towards the end of the webinar. Will, do you have anything to add about new revenue models for carriers?
Yeah, I would add the following. I think I agree that there's a potential to drive some new or interesting revenue models. Certainly, I agree with Michelle that people are excited about using it to encourage greater consumption, or to purchase temporary services to generate revenue by being able to offer different QoS, a way to get them to spend a little more money for a little more value. I would sort of go back to the previous question as well and say I think there's still a pretty big delta between what we as vendors have been able to dream up as interesting ways to use policy versus what's been able to be implemented out there in the field. So I still think there's a good way to go, but certainly carriers, as Ed mentioned, are starting to wake up and go in that direction. I mean, we get impatient as vendors typically because we are, sometimes years ahead in terms of brainstorming and whiteboarding and dreaming up this is possible, we can do this, versus the time that it shows up on the carrier's website.
So what are some of the things that you've dreamed up?
Well, I think Michelle certainly mentioned some of those. The ability to have a greater agility. People are using their mobile devices. Video is the one thing that causes congestion and needs to be managed and monitored. And so, for example, ensuring that people who need to look at video in high quality are having a good customer experience, and if they're willing to pay for that, taking advantage of that, that would certainly, I think, be the top of a lot of people's list. Ed certainly mentioned quality around VoLTE is another driver, and other services or new services like a VoLTE that need to go somewhat hand in hand with policy to ensure that customer experience.
Okay, and getting back to VoLTE for a minute, Edwin, I know that Amdocs has recently introduced a policy control solution specifically targeting VoLTE and has referenced some primary research around changes to policy control that carriers will need to make as they transition to VoLTE. So do you want to talk a little bit about what carriers may need to plan for if they are thinking about VoLTE?
Yeah. I mean, most of the PCRFs out there, or some of them, I won't paint them all with the same brush, so to speak, but they were built or conceived for data plan enforcement. And so they don't typically cut the mustard from a VoLTE, what is required in a VoLTE PCRF. Things like being able to serve emergency calls, having the availability and robustness that is expected as a PSTN replacement, being able to prioritize traffic. And now the assumption or the expectation is that there'd be geographic redundancy, even better than what's in the PSTN, just because that's the way networks work, right? And also because the PSTN was built on nodes that really serve, let's say a large one would be 100,000. But now our nodes, support millions of subscribers. So the whole availability model has changed, where you can't just say, okay, well, one node goes, that's tens of thousands of subscribers. Now it could be millions. So now you need some very high availability and very sophisticated kind of session continuity capabilities across geographic areas, right? So it's the whole availability, robustness, and of course emergency call handling to meet the regulatory requirements that are required, and the performance requirements, because now, if you compare a PSTN switch with what's required in a PCRF, really there's orders of magnitude difference. First of all, because of the number of subscribers that are being handled, and also the number of transactions required to support a VoLTE call setup, and also the ability to fall back. So again, we are still talking about connectionless services for VoLTE. It is an IP network in the end, and so something could happen to the bear that you've set up, and you have to be able to monitor that and fall back to, let's say, the 3G switch network. So all kinds of mechanisms in there to ensure that the call quality is potentially better and hopefully better, because that's what our customers are saying, that they will introduce HD voice. So someone will immediately be able to tell that they're on a higher quality voice, as well as the robustness that customers have come to expect.
Okay, thank you. That's very good. Now, does anyone else have anything else on new revenue models before we move on and start talking about virtualization? Okay, great. Well, before we begin virtualization, we're going to clear up some definitions, thanks to Will, who has provided us with this slide, and he's going to take us through this so that we can all be on the same page as far as what we're talking about when we talk about cloud or NFV or SDN.
Great, thanks. Yeah, I really just want to go through. I think that when you talk about this, a word like virtualization has a lot of meanings and definitions, and I just kind of wanted to list some of them in the context that we've been talking about for policy here. So virtualization and cloud, certainly means taking the applications like a PCRF or like a charging application that we have and adapting them as vendors to run on off-the-shelf hardware, adapting them to run as virtual machines, applications on virtual machines with hypervisors, be more efficient, drive lower CapEx and OpEx. And this has been something that's been going on, I think we would all agree, for quite a while in terms of trying to enable that and enable the benefits of that. So that's certainly one area that we want to talk about, I think, today. Two other trends that are going on, really adjacent to all of this is network functions virtualization and software-defined networks. More recent trends. So NFV is really in a carrier-led initiative. Carriers got together through this ETSI industry group and really drive the notion that, like, look, if we can virtualize compute and storage resources, why not be virtualizing a network? Why are we paying for a lot of special built, purpose-built appliances that are expensive? Why not use off-the-shelf hardware, software to support that? So it's really trying to drive CapEx, OpEx out of the network functions area, and that is rapidly evolving and changing the network. And then software-defined networks is adjacent to that, but different. Coming out of academia, this is really rethinking how networking and network connections and network design is done in a pretty revolutionary way. So something like OpenFlow, really separating a control plane from a data plane. It's centralizing the control. It's rethinking the way that we deliver and set up these services. But both of these last two things, in my opinion, relate to, as we look in the crystal ball and look going forward, how policy may potentially evolve. And I certainly challenge my my fellow colleagues here on the panel to think about how this may potentially broaden and add new challenges to the policy space from where they are now. I mean, an example I would give, you think about PCRF and sort of like it has a pretty specific definition today, driven by 3GPP and specifications. Where might that evolve, and how might these things evolve? If you look at things like, say, an HLR has evolved into an HSS in the mobile world. An HSS takes on greater attributes, more responsibility, more scope, et cetera. Protocols like a radius have evolved into things like a diameter that has a very broad scope and many different aspects to diameter communication. So I sort of see a potential for policy to go. It's kind of gone in some ways from network and gotten closer to IT and charging. And I think that what started out as simpler policy in the network is now getting more complex, driven by these two trends. So I think there's interesting things to come.
Michelle, would you agree with that?
Absolutely. What we're seeing, it doesn't matter whether you're a mobile provider, if you're a traditional cable provider, a satellite broadband provider, we're seeing the CSPs really beginning to evolve to the digital service provider. So as they begin to move away from the network and look to monetize these networks, we're really just seeing this as an evolution that's beginning, and a realization within a lot of organizations and within their ecosystems is that policy becomes more tightly coupled with charging itself, and not just something that's within the OSS network realm.
Okay, great. And the next question we have is, how can virtualized policy and charging impact OpEx and CapEx? But we've had a question from the audience, which we probably should have addressed earlier, which is just, can PCC save costs? And I think that we should address that before we even talk about virtualized PCC. So, Michelle, do you want to take that? And we'll give everybody a chance to chime in on that one.
Policy charging and control by itself does not necessitate that it's going to increase some savings. It may, in the fact that a legacy BSS system can't actually monetize the type of transactions or do it most cost effectively. So from that perspective, yes, I could see definitely a cost savings. But when you think of the grand scale of virtualization and CapEx and OpEx savings, I think that's where you're going to see the actual financial savings materialize.
Okay, great. Edwin,
more about,
go ahead.
Actually, one other comment. I think having policy charging and control really comes down to creating new monetization models that are no longer bound to the network or bound to legacy BSS.
Okay, great. And Edwin, did you want to answer the question as well?
Yeah, well, certainly PCC actually does save money, specifically in the revenue leakage area, where there is a very precise way of controlling your subscribers' usage. So you don't have to worry about lag, like in the olden days, which is, just over 5 years ago, but that's already olden days. There was some lag in terms of when you would know when someone went over a quota, and then your ability to charge them, and then you would have to have little buffers, and so you'd kind of be giving away free stuff. Not so bad when it's local, but when it's roaming, it's really bad. So dollars just leaking out the faucet, so to speak. So where PCC helped to control, at least from our experience with customers, is specifically on revenue leakage, where they had to basically go in favor of the subscriber because they didn't have any tools to actually kind of be confident that they hit the mark, hit the time when it was cut off or the quota. So that was something in general. And then the actual implementation of new services was greatly facilitated by the tools that a policy controller or a PCRF provides, because now you have everything kind of contained in one place. You have the access policy contained there. You have the dynamic policy there. You have the usage monitoring, because you can do that in a policy controller as well. You have the interaction with an OSS, so we can check balance. We can see if the quota is kind of is at a certain threshold that has to be considered for PCC rules. So this kind of concentration of control has really quite a bit of cost savings in terms of introducing new services.
Okay, great. And now let's talk a little bit about the cost savings that can arise as some of these services are decoupled from hardware and virtualized. Edwin, do you want to continue on?
Yeah, sure. So I mean, there's I guess, it's never good to say obvious because nothing's simple in our business, right? But certainly the ability to use, commercial off-the-shelf hardware platforms, the ability to virtualize platforms into what's called virtual machines, the ability to have elastic growth. So when you need more cores or more CPU horsepower, you can just somehow, kind of wave this magic wand. Obviously, it's not waving a magic wand, but you can add more compute power on the fly without having to install a new server. All these things are just fantastic, right? So the industry has tremendous, will gain tremendous benefits out of it, right? And I would say that from a control plane, so a policy control and charging, I think we've kind of got there to a large extent, because at least our software runs on commercial off-the-shelf compute platforms already with horizontal scalability and that. Now what service providers want to do even more is they don't want you to say, you can only run on this hardware or even deliver the hardware to them. They're going to have these server farms with VMs, and they're going to have these orchestrators that, just put the application on, a certain size VM and then elastically grow it based on performance. They'll also be able to provide isolation between, some customers demand infrastructure of their own, and they'll be able to provide that isolation and guaranteed performance without having to give them dedicated servers. So really, it will have tremendous benefits from a cost savings, not only CapEx, but also from OpEx, because now you have less machines to manage.
Okay, great. Does anybody else have anything to add on cost savings?
Yeah, I'll just add. I agree. I think that that it's not so much that PCC is being virtualized and this is somehow unique. It's that the ecosystem that the policy works in is itself fast moving towards virtualization and the network. And so it's a very sort of logical and complementary that if I'm trying to take network functions, run them on virtual machines, put them on COTS hardware, I would want to do the same thing to something like policy or to something like charging, because this, again, makes it part of the same ecosystem that I'm running. It makes it more possible to use, I think Ed mentioned orchestration tools as an example. There are a lot of new challenges around management and orchestration, which involve rules and policy being integral to that as well. So I think it's definite OpEx savings. I think the fact that people are moving quickly to do that for the network functions, we've been able to do that. I agree with that for quite a while in terms of something like a PCRF and policy, but there hasn't been as much push, and I think that the network being virtualized is going to be a real catalyst towards people saying, hey, this makes sense for all of this stuff to be managed with a pool of resources.
Okay, great.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I mean, just want to, the vendors, the hardware vendors and network vendors, right, they spend lots of money building their own ASICs, right, specialized silicon to differentiate themselves in the market. And of course, that specialized silicon eventually becomes a system, but it is fairly expensive because there's a high margins there. When now you buy compute platforms that are commercial off the shelf, and maybe you need two instead of one because the specialized hardware doesn't have the optimization that their ASICs provide, but still, two instead of one at a very lower price point will become very attractive. And I agree with I think it was Kyle before. I mean, when the network functions come into the game, it's going to have tremendous benefit to service providers.
Okay, now let's talk go ahead,
sorry.
Michelle. No,
yeah, but we also have to look at the other side of the house, which has to do with the BSS, and I think we will continue to see the pressures and the trends to virtualize the BSS and to actually be able to realize, of course, those CapEx and OpEx savings that transcend beyond the network into the heart of the ecosystems for these operators. So I think that's going to continue to gain momentum, and I think it's going to become table stakes as we move forward beyond just simple PCRF for policy, but policy control and charging in the entire BSS ecosystem.
Okay, great. Now we are going to talk a little bit about security and cloud, but I do want to mention to everyone that the slides we have here will be available through this webinar on YouTube. You can go to the RCR Wireless YouTube channel and search for this webinar and see these slides again. I know particularly Will's slide with the definitions was very instructive. So let's move on. Michelle, I know that you have some thoughts about that you actually heard from people who want to try to run PCC in a public cloud and that things are different from one geography to another. So can you talk about that a little bit?
Oh, absolutely. So we all know that private clouds allow the service provider to apply the principles of virtualization and cloud that really have been pioneered by the Amazons, the Googles, the SoftLayers, the rack spaces, et cetera, in their own data centers. But the public cloud tends to really offer more attractive OpEx, CapEx propositions. But we really see, and in practicality, that the service providers really lose that element of control when they have to rely on a public cloud partner to cover issues around application placement, data management, data location, et cetera. And in many jurisdictions, the public cloud may not even be possible because of privacy laws, physical data locations, that are needed to support a public cloud. And equally, the infrastructure available for a lot of these emerging markets may not provide enough reliability and performant connections into the public cloud. So we really see that it's going to really depend on the region of the country, the countries in region, the regional laws, the regulations within a specific country will really dictate whether or not it's possible to have it in a public cloud, or is a private cloud, of course, more secure and will ensure low latency that they might not get in a public cloud environment. And all of that's also focused not only on data security and sovereignty, but also on a positive customer experience when it comes to latency.
Okay, great. Now, one thing has come up in our questions that is interesting. As PCC, does change and it becomes in some cases more virtual, is it run by IT? Is it run by a network team? Does anybody have any insight on that? Who's in charge within a carrier?
I would say that what we're seeing actually is that there is really a merger between the so-called CIO and the CTO, and we are seeing that in our customers where there really is no need for both groups anymore, and I think we'll see a consolidation, and no one's going to be talking about it. Certainly, 5 years from now, there's no way there'll be two groups, and as a result of network, virtualization and everything running on the same compute platform, someone would be pretty hard pressed to say, hey, we need two groups to do this, right? Even though that's what's happened in the last 50 years. But I don't think that it's going to be one or the other. I think there's going to be a consolidation, and there'll be only one group.
Okay, great. And then what about, this is actually coming up on the next slide, but it's related, outside vendors like yourselves versus internal individuals. Are you finding that you handle big parts of this for your customers, or once they have the product, they are pretty much in charge of the maintenance? Does anybody have anything to say on that?
Well, yeah. So being able, first of all, you have to, be able to run in the different deployment models. Many operators still run in the on-premise model and have all the responsibilities themselves. But more and more, we're seeing a movement to a true managed services where the operator really wants to focus on being innovative and wants all of the operations run in managed services, and really alleviates a lot of the pressure of having to really manage and run a virtualized or even a non-virtualized environment.
Okay,
and
great.
that goes for the OSS and BSS.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
By the way, I think it depends on the scale of the service provider. We certainly see the bigger ones wanting to do it all on their own and make sure they're trained properly. We do see that in the smaller ones there is some attractiveness because they usually are a little bit more of follow the leader, so to speak, in terms of new things that are invented, whereas the bigger ones want to be the leaders, and so they want to have more control. But they're not totally related, virtualization and hosting and managing service, because you could have one without the other.
Well, that is a very good point. And let's talk a little bit about the databases, which the policy control software can access. And I think some changes are going on here. Michelle, I know you've had some things to say about this in the past when we talked before. Do you want to start with this one?
Sure. So, from a data perspective, in the context of virtualization, there definitely would be impacts in terms of issues around privacy, data location, particularly if the virtualization strategy is linked to, say, a full cloud-based deployment. So the trends in virtualization really are leading through to a new class of, say, in-memory databases that are better aligned with the promise of virtualization. The area is, though, a complex one. So some databases sacrifice transactional safety or functionality in favor of truly distributed scale. And some of these approaches have been well proven in the field, but may not really be suitable choices for two charging systems where the customer balances have traditionally been, sacrosanct. So we can see this is an area of significant investment in both terms of research, in terms of commercial availability, and the platforms. And in reality, we believe that a one-size-fits-all, may not apply, and that there would be a combination of traditional and in-memory may offer the best of both worlds. So the service providers are going to need to make those choices on, their level of transactional safety that they require across their application stack, and where they may be willing to accept something that might be considered a little less safe in favor of greater economical scale.
Okay, great. Does anybody else have anything on databases? Okay. Well, I think security is something that we have somewhat already touched on when we talked about private and public clouds, unless anybody else has any other comments specifically around security issues. Okay, well, let's move on to talk a little bit about the hardware investment and, how the move towards virtualization can impact existing investments in hardware that a carrier has made, and what some of those considerations might be. Edwin, would you be willing to take that one to start with?
Yeah, sure. I did touch on it before, and I think we've come to somewhat of a conclusion on the panel that the ability to run on commercial off-the-shelf hardware has already been done for PCRF and for charging systems, right? And the major impact, of course, virtualization adds to that with the ability to then grow in an elastic manner through an orchestration function. And that in itself is very beneficial, because now you don't have to add servers for isolation and for security purposes, and just for regular, scalability. You can right up front invest in a very large platform that has a large amount of compute platform, and then slice and dice it as you require. So a very attractive model. I think from the network plane, that is really, that's going to provide the next step function, so to speak, in CapEx benefits. And like I said before, maybe you have to buy 2 boxes instead of 1, but still those 2 boxes are going to be a lot cheaper than the other one. Certainly not a good story for the network equipment vendors, which, we are not. So, no problems there. But it'll be interesting how it actually evolves and how they can still differentiate whereas the COTS way is so much cheaper.
Right. Well, you do bring up a good point about the network equipment vendors, because they are very much aware of that as well, and they're working hard to get into software and frankly to compete with you with solutions that work seamlessly with their hardware. So do we want to talk a little bit about that trend and how maybe solutions that come directly from the software world may have some appeal for operators?
Yeah, I'll certainly chime in on that. I mean, I work for a company that's sort of simultaneously a network vendor and a software company at the same time, so we're kind of burning the candle at both ends. I think you're definitely seeing a shakeup in the network world in terms of impacts. You're not going to see companies like Cisco and Ericsson and Huawei just melt away into the distance. It's not happening. They have a very strong incumbency. They have lots of their hardware in place. So I mean, I think rule number one is carriers are not going to throw away perfectly good equipment that they have in their networks and their data centers right now. This is going to be an evolution, not ripping and replacing everything that's there. But in some places it's happening quickly, and certainly where you're trying to add and build incrementally capabilities, it will make a lot of sense to incrementally build those capabilities in a virtualized fashion as opposed to the traditional fashion. And over time, I think you'll see a transition. There's also, I think you were alluding to the notion that there's potential new entrants into to the market. So absolutely, they're seeing names that of vendors of network functions or of software that you hadn't seen before. Companies that are startups or smaller companies, venture funded, that now have the ability to go in and work and sell right alongside some of the big names. So when you start to move things towards COTS hardware, when you start, also another trend I would add is to the embracing of open source software and open standards is also heavily being pushed. So that also encourages and breaks down some of the cost of entry for other companies to come in. So it's a little bit of a Wild West in terms of when a carrier goes out and says, who can help me now with this network problem? You have a lot of different types of companies raise their hand and say, hey, we can help you. Whereas before, I think it was a little more dominated by some of the larger players and a much higher cost of entry.
Right. A lot more choice and a lot more opportunity as well. Now, I think we've already pointed out that virtualization is different than a move to the cloud, but they can coexist. And so I'd like to touch on the idea of software that has moved to the cloud but still needs to work with a carrier's existing network hardware. Are there challenges? Are there latency issues there? Is there anything that people need to know about that?
I think that the real-time system latency really becomes critical at that point. Is a performance indicator and typically has a direct impact on the customer's experience. So if the network element itself has to communicate with software that is moved to the cloud, then it really may result in the replacement of their local area network with a wide area network to improve round-trip latency or eliminate or minimize that. So the whole focus has to be at that point is preventing a negative impact on the customer's experience, and that all has to be factored in.
Okay, great. Thank you. Does anybody else have anything to add on this issue? Okay.
I mean, I just want to do, it is true, there is a budget. In other words, how many hundreds of milliseconds or how many tens of milliseconds to set up what's called a PDP context, and then we have to work within the budget. It will be interesting if there is, if there's an option for relaxing that budget, so to allow for hosted applications. Notwithstanding, it will introduce latency and will affect the experience, but it might not be noticeable. So I don't know if the jury is out on that one yet. Certainly, we're being, and we'll see how that evolves. Right?
I think part of the trends in the network too, you're finding, is to centralize more and more some of the network functions that were a little more decentralized. And I think that also goes hand in hand with what you're talking about. When you do that, now you still have to be able to get to that central function, and where does it live?
Yeah.
And how does that affect the sort of, as you said, the latency model? But in general, I think that makes it easier to control things because you centralize them and you have a broader span of control as well.
Okay, well, we do have one more question from the audience, if anyone wants to take this one. What is the benefit of virtualization for EPC components already available on COTS? Does anybody have any comment on that one? Well, we will.
I would just say there's, it's a similar benefit to saying to say taking just I have IT software. It's not running on a hypervisor on a virtual machine. Why would I do that? It's typically OpEx benefits of making it easier to run and manage and deploy in a virtualized world. I start up a whole virtual machine and it has an entire environment ready to go at the press of a button, as opposed to perhaps a more difficulty in migrating or starting up or shutting down environments. So yeah, if you already have components that are running on off-the-shelf software, great. You're 90% of the way there, and you'll typically find that people that are out there in the market today selling and pushing virtualized network functions are companies where the software they had was already gone pretty far down this path towards either off-the-shelf hardware or open standards or common architecture and middleware, as opposed to going further in the direction towards what Ed had mentioned about specialized ASIC chips and specialized, very tuned architectures that are really more dependent on the hardware itself.
Okay, Will, thank you so much for taking that question from the audience. Go ahead. I'm sorry, did you have something, Edwin?
No.
Okay, I thought I heard you say something. Okay, this last question about job responsibilities is one that we have already covered, and we are running out of time. So I would like to take a minute to thank each of you for being here today. Edwin Gans, Director of Product Line Management at Amdocs Data Experience Business Unit. Thank you very much for joining us today, and feel free to share at this time any closing comments that you would like to make.
Actually, I thought it was quite a good webinar. I think we covered quite a bit of ground. It is going to be fun to watch our industry as it evolves from non-virtualized to virtualized, and elasticity within clouds and such. So just hold on for the ride.
Yeah, this has been great. I've learned a lot. Michelle Nowak, Vice President of Product Management at CSG International. Thanks a lot for making the time today.
Thank you. It was a pleasure being here, and Edwin and Will, great to have you as panelists with me today. Very good discussion.
Yeah, I do want to remind everybody that in a few hours we will be posting this on the RCR Wireless YouTube channel, so please look for it there, because I know that there's a lot of good information that we've covered here. Will Rotch, it was great to meet you today. Thank you so much for being here. Will is Director of Solution Architecture at NetCracker.
Yeah, thanks. I enjoyed it. I think it's an interesting time for policy. I think we're in the throes of implementing a lot of the interesting policy that we've dreamt up over the last few years, and that's going well. And then I think we're also at an inflection point where there will be some pretty good dramatic changes as networks get virtualized going forward.
All right, lots of subjects for future webinars. Okay, thank you all for joining us today. This has been Policy, Control, and Charging, RCR Wireless News, and this will conclude the webinar.